I want to welcome everybody tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And this is our panel discussing the Charter Amendment Measure 29 proposal created by Compassion Seattle. So thank you to the over 850, I think we now have almost 900 registered attendees who have taken this time to get civically engaged. And you've submitted over 100 questions for our panelists, which is amazing. And a special thanks as well to our panelists and our moderator, who I will introduce a little bit later, for volunteering their time to make this event a success. Belltown United is a neighborhood coalition composed of volunteers, including representatives from our business association and community council, who are dedicated to advocating for the interests of neighborhood businesses, property owners, and residents. Our foremost goals are to promote inclusion and connection, embrace urban growth, and celebrate the amazing diversity of people and places in our neighborhood. Tonight's event is part of our Belltown United Presents series, which is dedicated to programming that benefits both the Belltown neighborhood and our friends and neighbors across Seattle. Belltown itself is Seattle's densest urban center and one of 5 neighborhoods that form what we all know as downtown Seattle. Our neighborhood, and likely everyone who has registered for tonight's event, has been touched in one way or another by the immense challenges Seattle faces related to homelessness, drug addiction, and mental health. Thank you for engaging with us, and please consider continuing to connect by visiting belltownunited.org. I would now like to introduce our panelists and moderator. Lisa Daugaard is director of the Public Defender Association in Seattle that works to develop and implement alternatives to the criminal legal system that advance public safety, racial equity, community health, and reconciliation, and provides technical support to other communities seeking similar solutions nationally and internationally. Previously, Lisa served as interim deputy director at the King County Department of Public Defense and was deputy director and misdemeanor supervisor at the Defender Association. Jon Scholes is president and CEO of the Downtown Seattle Association, a 2,100 member league of property owners and businesses formed in 1958 to create a healthy, vibrant downtown. Jon's role at DSA as the program manager for the Metropolitan Improvement District extends to overseeing the 285 block mid-business improvement area established in 1999 to provide cleaning, safety, transportation, marketing, and public realm management services in downtown Seattle. Jon has spent more than 20 years working in nonprofit advocacy and lives in downtown Seattle with his wife and their 11-year-old twins. Tiffani McCoy is the advocacy director at Real Change, where she has worked for 4 years. She previously served as field director and the statewide field organizer to the I-735 campaign. While at Real Change, Tiffani has worked with vendors to win several campaigns, including funding the Mobile Pit Stop program and the Seattle Street Sync, and advocating for progressive revenue to solve our housing crisis, including a current campaign to fund hundreds of RV safe lot spaces with wraparound services. Mark Sidran served as the Seattle City Attorney from 1990 to 2001, and with the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office from 1976 to 1985. Mark currently serves on the King County Sexual Assault Resource Center since 2015 and assisted DESC, the Downtown Seattle Emergency Services Center, from 2003 to 2015. Finally, our moderator, Danny Westneat, has been a columnist and reporter for the Seattle Times for over 2 decades. His prolific award-winning journalism spans well over 1,000 articles covering myriad topics that impact our city. Through his journalism, Danny has become intimately familiar with the challenges that come before us tonight as part of the CA29 proposal created by Compassion Seattle. And so as we kick off tonight's panel discussion, I'd like to make 2 notes. We will put the text of the proposed charter amendment on the screen as it's needed. And I'd like to add a polite reminder for all of our amazing panelists to please use non-filibuster level responses. And with that, Danny, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I am Danny Westneat with the Seattle Times. I'm excited to be here because this panel has some extremely informed people coming at this from a wide range of differing opinions, which I think is a real public service that Belltown United put together. Also give a shout out to the public. This is the nicest evening of the year so far. And 900 of you signed up to stare into a grainy Zoom screen and talk about homelessness. So to me, that's the beating heart of Seattle right there. Like he said, we're here to learn about Charter Amendment 29, a ballot measure that seeks to address chronic street homelessness. It's currently in the signature gathering stage, and they have designs on making the November ballot this fall. So I wanted to start by just laying out some basic things that this measure tries to do. And these will be very simplified, but this is just to try to get us all operating on the same page, starting off. So first, this measure was crafted by business folks in conjunction with some nonprofit homeless service providers without the involvement of anyone from City Hall or the City Council. The campaign part of it so far has been financed mostly by business developers like Urban Visions and Vulcan and Howard Wright and so forth. It seeks to amend the city charter, which is like our city constitution, which I'm sure we'll hear more about later. It does a few main things that are really important. It calls on the city to create 2,000 units of emergency shelter or permanent housing for the homeless in the first year, which would be next year, 2022. It calls for the city to fund mental health and substance abuse treatment services in conjunction with these 2,000 units of shelter, though at some funding level that's not really specified. It attempts to link the provision of this emergency shelter that I just mentioned with clearing unauthorized encampments, which I'm certain we'll hear more about in a minute. It requires the city to spend a minimum of 12% of its annual budget on this topic. It requires periodic data reports to see if it's working. And finally, it expires in 6 years' time. So there's more to it about permitting, emergency permitting of housing and so forth that's really important, but I want to get to the panel experts quickly as possible. We're fortunate tonight we have two people who helped write this measure. They were in the room where it happened, so to speak. So we can pester them directly about what this seeks to do. So I'm going to start with Jon Scholes of the Downtown Seattle Association, the aforementioned business group. You were there, John. Why did you draft this away from City Hall without much input from them? And what specifically are you hoping to accomplish with it?
Well, thanks, Danny, for moderating tonight. And thanks to Steve and Belltown United for convening this important conversation. We came to the table because Seattle right now is the third largest homeless population in the United States behind New York and LA. It's been nearly 6 years since our city and county declared a state of emergency around homelessness, and we've only seen the problem get worse. Today, nearly 4,000 people find themselves unsheltered throughout the city of Seattle in our parks and alleys and sidewalks. The mortality rate for people that are unsheltered within King County is 15 times the general population. And today we're spending more than ever to address a problem that's only gotten worse. And we can see that in Ballard Commons, in downtown, and Capitol Hill, and throughout the city of Seattle. So this is an emergency. This is a crisis. We need to act as we've declared it as such nearly 6 years ago. This is a public health crisis, and the current approach is failing. We have dysfunction, disagreement within City Hall. And we don't have a coherent, clear approach that's compassionate, accountable, and delivering results that we all want to see, which is bringing more people inside that are suffering today so that we can open up our parks and public spaces and sidewalks. So this is the problem we face in our city. It's clearly an emergency. We haven't acted like it is, and we need to. That's what this charter amendment would require.
Okay, let me get some response to that from an opponent. Tiffani McCoy is with Real Change, Seattle's outstanding street paper. Tiffani, you were quoted previously saying that you smell a rat with this measure, and you have advised people don't be fooled by Compassion Seattle. So give us what you mean by that. What about this is a rat in your view? Whoops.
Unmute myself.
Thank you.
There we are. Thank you. Yeah, thanks, as John said, to Belltown United and Danny Westneat for hosting and for allowing the perspective that I bring and to have the House Our Neighbors Coalition have a voice at this panel. Yeah, I think that this is kind of a really classic example. You know, arguably we live in a post-truth era. And we get to just play with words however we see fit. And this is the magic of words. You wish away or you define away all sorts of brutal histories and realities by just using another word. So compassion is like the hallmark of what they say that they're trying to do. But what this would do is codify actually the status quo of what is happening around encampment removals in the city of Seattle right now, how the mayor has moved us in this way of like clearing everything under this umbrella of a public health emergency or an obstruction. So it would codify the status quo in a lot of ways. And if it was very serious about actually solving the crisis, it would pony up money. The millionaire backers behind this, the corporations, the real estate developers who are endorsing this and supporting this financially would just put their money where their mouth is and fund the things that are necessary that were shown in the McKinsey report.
So you feel that there'll be more sweeps under this or the same amount?
I would say that this codifies sweeps as a cornerstone of homelessness policy. The specific sentence in the charter amendment around shifting belongings, even if an encampment isn't closed. And I would also say that this is a maneuver by the Chamber of Commerce and the DSA and big business to have a stake in City Hall and buy an election. They were unsuccessful in 2019 trying to buy city council races with $1.5 million. And this year they're coming out not using that strategy, which is good because it failed miserably. But now they're trying to buy City Hall and the mayor's race through this issue and sensationalizing homelessness for political gain.
So, okay, thank you. So we have here Lisa Daugaard of the Public Defender Association. You were also in the room helping draft this. And I've known you over the years as someone who's done probably about as much as anyone in Seattle to defend the rights of homeless people to not be swept. You support this, why?
Because it's not a sweeps initiative. It would permanently, or for at least 6 years, move us past that point and commit the city to a framework that does work, which is to ensure that people aren't living outside because they are living somewhere that they voluntarily accepted that meets their needs and that is sustainable. That's not a light lift. That is a big commitment. And for me, it's funny that Tiffani, referenced the post-truth world. To be honest, like I'm going to say, I support this initiative, and I'm here to say that I support this initiative because it is really important that people be truth tellers. And looking at this screen, is not the first time that I've debated Mark Sidran, and we have been on the opposite sides of many issues. I have sometimes been on the same side of issues with Jon Scholes, but pretty often been on opposite or sort of at least not perfectly aligned positions. This is the first time I can readily remember being on the opposite side of a position from Tiffani. So I'm taking this position not because of who is on which side, but because it's the right place to be. I was in rooms where, and of course all virtual, when this was being written, but I was not part of the initiation of this strategy. And I will say, like, I don't know that a charter initiative is the thing that needs to. I don't think there is one thing that needs to happen, but I will say that I am certain that it is very valuable that business leaders and neighborhood leaders moved to this point of embracing a strategy of ending public homelessness, ending people living unsheltered in their neighborhoods, not by dispersal, not through sweeps, but by ensuring that people are offered in a way that is effective, respectful, and works for them, resources that are effective, culturally relevant, and work for them. And in this way that we actually make an impact on the absolutely, I really search for words, and this is like the people that I get to work with at PDA who are spending increasingly, you know, a lot of our time and energy doing the work of meeting people with appropriate resources, and feel very fortunate to be able to do that, not nearly at the scale we would like. But the conditions that people are living in and the circumstances that people are confronting are not like, we cannot keep staring at each other across the barricades as we have for so many years. I was just going back, well, I'll save this for later in the discussion, but I guess I'll just say I'm supporting this because, number one, the policy framework is the right one, it is the only one that works. And I, as a matter of personal principle, like to take yes for an answer. And so when people who have previously been on the other side of battles through empirical experience and, you know, trial and error, and getting to see that the navigation team and a sweeps approach failed and made matters worse. When those leaders in our community were willing to shift their position, I think it's really important to say yes, and I support this, and I'll stand with them.
All right, thank you for that. Let me bring Mark Sidran in so everyone has a chance. Mark, as was said, is the former city attorney of Seattle, so he's as well-versed as anyone with the city's laws. And Mark, you have said this measure will paralyze the city to the point that they won't be able to do anything about unauthorized encampments. How so? Expand on that.
Well, I don't think I actually said that. But first, let me also thank Steve Horvath and Belltown United for organizing this forum. I think it's a very useful thing to do, and I'm happy to participate in it. I'm wearing my T-shirt that reflects my mind being blown, and 29 blows my mind because I find myself on the same side as Tiffani and the ACLU, people with whom I think normally I would not agree about these issues, and on the opposite side of the business community and the Seattle Times and the establishment, people with whom I normally agree.
Our minds are blown too, Mark.
Yeah, well, and we have that in common. So my view of 29 is that it's the wrong thing to do, and it's the wrong way to do it in terms of amending the charter. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion about why the charter matters. But I don't believe I ever said that this was going to paralyze the city's ability to remove unauthorized encampments. My point is that right now, there is no legal barrier to removing encampments. Obviously, as Lisa suggests, there are important policy considerations, there are political considerations for sure, but they're not legal barriers to enforcing laws that we've had on the books for many years, like prohibiting camping in public parks or prohibiting camping or blocking sidewalks. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail later, but what's changed in the last 2 or 3 years is city policies that reflect a court decision called Martin versus Boise, Idaho. And I expect that we'll go into this in some detail because it's very important. But the bottom line is that while we currently have no legal barriers to removing encampments, if 29 passes, it will create those legal barriers. So it's not that it will make it impossible to clear encampments, it will make it more difficult. And I'll just close by saying, John and his colleagues wrote an op-ed piece in the Seattle Times that said, and I quote, that 29 affirms the city government's ability to immediately close encampments that pose a public health or safety risk or obstruct the use of public spaces. Well, number one, if that's true, and I don't believe it is, it would contradict Lisa's point about sweeps. It would affirm Tiffany's point that it will empower sweeps. But when we get the language, the actual language of 29 up on the screen so people can read it, I would encourage people to look for any language that suggests that it will enable the city to, quote, immediately close encampments. What 29 does is establish a process by which an encampment might or might not be closed. And that's creating a legal process and in effect creating a structure of rights for those who are encamped. And I think it will make it more difficult than it is today to remove encampments. Compassion is not Seattle's problem. It's, I think, a tribute to Seattle that we're a compassionate city. Common sense, political leadership, not so much. Compassion is a good thing. I think we need common sense Seattle and we need strong leadership Seattle. We don't need a charter amendment that's going to make these challenges more difficult.
Okay, so as an onlooker out here, I now have no idea what this initiative would actually do. So one of the people wrote in, we got 100 questions from the public, and I want to default as much as possible to those because they asked some really good questions. So as you all know, City Hall Park has been in the news lately because of the crowd, the even bigger crowd that's there now than is normally there, probably due to the pandemic. And then also because someone was killed there this past week. And the folks at the courthouse are, according to them, are being assaulted and so forth. And so there's a lot of outcry about the City Hall Park again. So someone wrote in, if Measure 29 were in place today, what would happen at City Hall Park? So would the city, one, be required to remove encampments from City Hall Park? Would they be prohibited from removing those encampments? Or three, would they have discretion to remove or allow the encampments? So maybe one of the proponents of the initiative could weigh in, Lisa or John. What would happen to City Hall Park?
I can tell you what my belief and hope is that the initiative would advance. I mean, no language, including language in the charter, is like idiot proof. You know what I mean? If we have leaders who are bent on misreading that language, it's still going to be hard. So it only moves the window, right? It moves the conversation. But my hope is that it moves the conversation so that the approach used is one of careful assessment of the situation of the people there. I will say the team that I work with in Just Care has done that twice now in recent months. And we have a pretty good understanding of where people came from, and most people were displaced there from sweeps in other locations. So City Hall Park is like exhibit A of why sweeps don't work, and why if Mark is right and this initiative ends sweeps, that's a good thing. As I said, rhetoric around like end sweeps. I mean, no one has ever actually proposed to literally end all city authority to remove an encampment that was in a particularly or an individual camper who's in a particularly vulnerable or dangerous situation. All proposals about, even when they're called end sweeps, always have that caveat. And I just before the debate was going back to look at a particular approach, an ordinance that Real Change, my office, the ACLU, Columbia Legal Services, and the Seattle King County Coalition on Homelessness proposed back in 2016. It was referred to as the encampment ordinance. And at the time, business opposed it and it died. So we lost. But what we were trying to do was end the practice of sweeps, say that people couldn't be removed unless they were offered housing. And I think that this current initiative goes further than that, honestly. Instead of focusing on offering, it focuses on acceptance, on willing. The word willing is in this initiative. It focuses on it actually working. Somebody saying yes, because what is offered matches their situation and they have trust, and sustaining that. You don't just, have somebody check into a hotel for a day. You have a sustained plan that that person can rely on. They're not going to be discharged back to the street or just kicked out a couple weeks later. In any event, it has always been the case that even people who, like myself, oppose sweeps for all the reasons. They are inhumane, they're devastating, they make the situation worse, they're ineffective, they're all of those things. No one has ever proposed that the city should completely have its hands tied with respect to really dire, particular situations that are more dire than just generally living outside, which is dire to begin with. So no, this amendment won't bar the removal of people in particularly acute conditions. But that shouldn't be what happens at City Hall Park, because the people there can be engaged and supported in appropriate match shelter. And that could happen within the next couple of months, and it should happen within the next couple of months. In my opinion, that methodology is what this initiative makes much more likely.
So I'll get to you, Tiffany, because I see you raising your hand. But real quick, what you're saying, Lisa, that what's different here is that basically the just care model would be this. You see this Charter 29 amendment as like just care on steroids. It's like just care times 2,000 units.
Well, 2,000 units is not what is needed. That is what the initiative calls for as a minimum.
No, I understand that, but
in the first year.
It's a lot more than you have now. So.
I would say steroids is more than 2,000 units. And the questions that have come up about, the difference between emergency shelter and permanent housing are really important, really valid. My hope is that conversation.
Danny, can I add to Lisa's response though?
No, hold on. I skipped over Tiffany and I shouldn't have. I'm sorry, Tiffany.
Sorry, Tiffany.
You raised your hand and you wanted to say something. Go ahead.
No, all good. I looked for the raise your hand button. I couldn't find it.
Oh,
so
I saw you.
The old-fashioned way. So yeah, I want to go back to what Lisa had said about, the 2015-2016 ordinance and specifically calling out real change first. I would say on that we are in a new period at Real Change. We have new leadership. We were part of that coalition with the ACLU, and the ACLU was a strong proponent of that amendment or that charter, goodness gracious, of that ordinance that Lisa spoke about. But if it's the same as it is now, then the ACLU is then indirectly being called hypocritical, because the ACLU has serious concerns that if Charter Amendment 29 were implemented, that it would not comply with Martin v. Boise, and they were involved in that. And if it is so good, if it was as good as that 2015-2016 ordinance, why then were advocates kept out of this room? Why then was the Lived Experience Coalition not asked to get on board? Why were folks that are vendors at Real Change or Nicholsville or Share a Wheel, why were they not part of these discussions? If the aim was truly to get everyone in the room to meet in this fanciful center, I'm just very curious why all of these people were kept out from these discussions. The Lived Experience Coalition, by the way, has endorsed House Our Neighbors and is fighting actively against this charter amendment.
John?
I was just going to address your earlier question, Danny, of what would happen at City Hall Park should this charter amendment be in place, and add to Lisa's comments. And what would happen is what has happened at 3rd and Pike and Union over the last couple of weeks. If the city was required to scale the investments that have been successful in bringing people inside, and the situation there over the better part of 2 months was 40 or so folks living on the sidewalk on 3rd Avenue in tents. Most of those individuals in really vulnerable conditions and situations with mental illness and substance use disorder. And Lisa's team at Just Care over the course of a week and a half or so moved 31 of those folks inside without the involvement of a single police officer. And then the folks that were there preying on individuals that were running shoplifting operations that were taking advantage and harming others were dealt with in other ways. And that in many ways is what we find in City Hall Park today, a mix of activity, a lot of vulnerable people preyed on by others, But we don't have the resources as a city. We haven't invested in scaling the programs that we know work to be able to go in there and make a difference. And that is playing out in other parts of our city. So I like the results that we got at 3rd and Pike between Pike and Union just a couple of weeks ago, and the great work that Lisa and her team did. I think that's the solution we all want to see, is let's bring people inside. That's a solution we got, and we can scale it by adopting Charter Amendment 29.
So you're saying you cleared an encampment without a suite?
We cleared an encampment by bringing people inside, and it's the only way that we effectively open up parks and public spaces and sidewalks and help people. And I think there's a fundamental disagreement between myself and folks like Mark, who I think are advocating for the bare minimum and arguing about legal standards and case law. And if we accept this as a public health crisis, we would never say, let's provide the bare minimum. That's not how we fought this pandemic. It's not how we fought smallpox. It's not how we fight any other public health crisis facing our community. It's to say, let's provide the bare minimum and hope for the best. And that's what we've been doing in this city for the last 5 or 6 years, and it hasn't worked. We move people from one park to the next, from one sidewalk to the other, and we see more and more people, and we're spending more and more money. We shouldn't provide the bare minimum. We should provide what works to bring people inside. That's what this charter amendment would do.
All right, let me, I want to get to this question of, just a minute, Lisa, of bringing people inside and the idea of where we're going to bring them inside to, because we got a great question from a formerly homeless person.
John, Danny, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was hoping to be able to respond to the question you asked.
What was the question?
Regarding what to do about City Hall Park, and the other 3 panelists responded to it. Are you moving on from that question?
I was, but go ahead.
Well, I'd like to respond to it.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate John's comment, although I think it's a complete mischaracterization of what I believe and does not reflect in any way what I said. This would be an excellent time to have Steve put up the actual language of the charter amendment so that people can read it. You know, what Lisa and John and I and Tiffany think is all well and good. We have our views, but the critical thing is we are being asked as voters to adopt a law. Laws are words with consequences. And
okay, it's up.
Let's look at these words and let's just
talk about it.
All right. Let's take a moment. Hopefully people can see it and read along. I encourage you to read along, and Steve has provided some color highlighting, which is helpful. But if you read this from start to finish, you will find that it describes a process in which there will be a balancing. You'll find down around the 3rd sentence, it says the city, there you go, shall balance the city's strong interest in keeping public spaces clear and the possible, not probable or likely, but the possible harm to individuals caused by closing encampments. So number 1, there will be a process of balancing the needs and interests of the campers and the public interest with respect to that space. And then it goes on, again, if you read it, to basically talk about how there shall be, in appropriate cases, intervention. And it says, while there is no right to camp in any particular space, it is city policy to avoid as much as possible dispersing people, except to safe and secure housing, unless remaining in place poses particular problems related to public health or safety or interferes with the use of the public space by others. And then it says, in those circumstances where the city does not close an encampment, the city may still require individuals to shift their belongings and any structures to ensure safety, accessibility, and to accommodate the use of public spaces. Now, there's nothing about this process, which will be a legal mandate for the city. There's nothing about this process that is immediate. As John noted, it took weeks to clear an encampment on 3rd Avenue. City Hall Park has been an encampment for years. And this process, which will be a legal mandate, is going to, as I say, make it legally more difficult to clear encampments. And courts will tell us what what it means in the end. But if you think about other cities, John, for example, mentioned New York City has the most homeless in the United States. But if you've been to New York City, you will not see encampments the way we have them here, nor will you see them in Boston or in Chicago, or for that matter, in cities closer to Seattle. So it is possible to be a compassionate city, to be a progressive city, to try to meet the needs of people on the street, but also to have a very clear and I think simple rule. You cannot camp in a public park, or you cannot camp in a public sidewalk in ways that conflict with the public's use of that space. Now, prior to 2019, we had homeless population for a long time, and we have had encampments for a long time, but they were not in the parks and on the streets prior to approximately 2019. There was a certain tolerance policy for encampments in green belts in the jungle and so on. And I think everybody on the panel will agree encampments are a bad thing. And everybody will agree that we want more housing and more services, and we want to humanely get people out of encampments. But that is not inconsistent with saying there are certain basic rules. Rules matter, and every tent city, for example, every organized encampment has a long list of rules for their residents about what's permitted, what's not permitted. And it's important to have clarity and certainty about what the rules are, both in terms of the courts and the law, but it's also important for people to understand what the rules are. If the rule is you can encamp on 3rd Avenue on the sidewalk and it will be weeks, or in City Hall Park, it'll be months before there's any action taken because of the process, you're setting up a dynamic where it's not clear whether you can encamp, where you can encamp, and that in the end is going to encourage, frankly, encampment. A city that offers a policy of housing.
I gotta stop you, man. You're filibustering us.
All right, thank you.
You made an excellent point. I still don't know what's going to happen to City Hall Park, unfortunately, but I think I'm going to move on to the big thing that strikes me as an onlooker that's different about this initiative, at least potentially, is the shelter part. And we haven't talked about that yet. And we got a question from a person who had experience with homelessness, and I wanted to just read it to you because I thought it was a really outstanding question. So she writes, as a teenager who was homeless both in Port Angeles and Seattle, I would like to know if Danny Westneat or any of the panelists has seen what an emergency shelter looks like over the course of 24 hours. For example, shelter consists of mattresses on the floor of the day program that are pulled down each night by shelter staff. She was talking about a particular shelter, and I took its name out. In another youth emergency shelter, I was raped while I slept. Emergency shelter, in quotes, sounds like a very nice solution to people who have never experienced homelessness. So what are we talking about when we talk about emergency shelter in Charter Amendment Measure 29?
I'd be happy to address that, Danny. I think I think what the individual references is really sort of central to the failure in our city over the last 5 or 6 years. That's essentially what we've been offering is you need to move out of this park and we've got a shelter space for you downtown. You've got to wait in line for an hour to get into it. You can't bring your belongings or your pet or your partner. And at 7 in the morning, you've got to get out and you're sleeping on a floor on a mat next to 6 inches from somebody else among 150 or 200 other people. I have visited those places, not overnight, but I visited many of them. I serve on the board of Downtown Emergency Service Center, as Mark has for many years as well. And they operated one of those congregate shelters at the Morrison, and the pandemic forced a different model that has been proven incredibly successful based on the University of Washington's recent study and based on everybody's just own eyes of just seeing the progress and positive impact that's been made on people's lives. So this charter amendment changes and requires a change in what we are offering. And it's not the bare minimum of a shelter where we can cram a bunch of people in that you've got to leave at 6 in the morning, but better and safer and healthier single room, temporary housing and permanent housing solutions, hotel rooms, tiny home villages, and other locations that are more dignified and have been proven to be more effective in stabilizing people and helping them address their needs. And those shelters, importantly, didn't have a significant amount of treatment services and other critical services that are necessary to help address the underlying issues that are forcing so many people to be outside today. So that is a big shift and a fundamental shift in the approach here that will be required by the Charter Amendment.
So this guarantees that these 2,000 units, if they're not permanent housing, which seems like it'd be hard to build in a year, if they're emergency shelter, that they would be non-congregate, a room of your own.
That's right.
The actual language is the city-funded behavioral health programs and services shall be in combination with access to emergency housing in enhanced shelters, tiny houses, hotel motel rooms, other forms of non-congregate temporary housing or permanent housing.
Okay, so if that's true, that seems like an enormous shift to me. It's also going to be enormously expensive, which we'll talk about in a minute. But wouldn't that be, is that a part of this measure, Tiffani McCoy, that you're happy with, or no?
You know, when we talk about this, and I hear all of this really great language of what we're going to do with a slated $18 million more that's going to be set aside above what we already spend, you know, I'm taken aback by it. Yeah, I don't, these are not going to be permanent housing units. Any idea that these are going to be permanent and that they're going to come online in the next year is just like, it's just a falsehood. That's not at all what's going to happen. And we're just focusing on these short-term solutions, and that's a zero-sum game. The responses of challenging this, we want to really get into the long-term solutions, and this doesn't focus on long-term solutions at all. It sunsets in 6 years, as if like the $18 million extra a year is going to pay for wraparound services, permanent housing units, mental health care, outreach workers, and a path to housing with $18 million more. That's not a real solution. It's not a political, this is not a political game, people's lives. And this also does nothing for 50% of the folks who are experiencing homelessness, because as John said, we have about 4,000 that are living unsheltered outside. We don't know the true number because we didn't have a count this last year due to COVID. So we're just forgetting 2,000 people outside. Also, this does nothing at all to deter the inflow of homelessness. We're on the precipice of a massive wave of evictions. And I know that we know that that's coming, and we know that evictions lead to homelessness. So this does nothing to even stave off the flow of what's going to happen, because we've lacked leadership at the federal, the state, the county, the city level. So again, we just need to focus on the numbers. This isn't funded. If there was true desire to build all of these great things that John is talking about, they would have put the money forward. They would have identified a source. Also, there wouldn't have been litigation against Jumpstart, which is going to put aside $150 million a year for permanent housing. And I just can't help but think, if the businesses didn't fight against the Amazon tax a couple of years ago, how many more permanent housing units could have come online by now if that fight didn't happen?
Okay, so why 2,000 units? Where did that figure come from? Because I think it would house more than 2,000 people, because not everyone stays in a unit for the full year, but we've never stood up 2,000 non-congregate shelter units before in a year's time. So it seems like to me, as a difficult to reach goal because it's so big, but at the same time, you can critique it for being too small. So where did that figure come from?
Yeah, you're right. We never have done that. And that's partly why we've seen the problem only get worse, because we haven't acted with a sense of urgency that's required given the emergency and crisis we face. We felt like 2,000 was an achievable number within the first year. That was important to set a clear metric to hold city government accountable to. And when we've put our mind to big things, we've achieved them. We stood up Lumen Field to vaccinate 22,000 people a day. We've moved with great urgency and speed. We've broken rules and cut through tape. to address lots of other challenges in our community. And as we all are well aware now, are the fastest city in the country to achieve 70% vaccination. We should take that same playbook that has been so successful over this last year of moving together the business community, nonprofit community, and government to address the public health crisis that is coronavirus, to apply that same approach to chronic homelessness. So 2,000 is achievable. The city will be required to report on a quarterly basis, at least to the public, on their progress. And coupled with the investments that County Executive Dow Constantine's making through the Health Through Housing initiative of acquiring hotels throughout the county, and the charter amendment, we can make a big dent in the number of people that are sleeping outside in the city today.
I'd like to really affirm what Tiffani is saying about how important it will be, and quite a few of the questions that have come in the chat have raised the same question. This isn't going to work if the investment is only in emergency shelter, and it's not going to work if the investment is only in permanent housing. The permanent housing ramp up is too slow to fully respond to the current state of affairs and the current condition in a way that will be meaningful and build legitimacy. But if the investment is only in temporary housing, that will immediately fill, or emergency housing, shelter, these are all synonyms that different people use, but not anything short of permanent housing. Those will immediately fill, and then we will be stuck again, as has happened every time, some small measure of appropriate enhanced shelter, hotels, motels, or tiny homes open. There's a momentary, people say yes, they fill up, and then the wall comes down again because we're out of capacity. So the back door has to open and people have to be able to move to permanent housing. I want to share that the language in the initiative says that the city or its designees shall appropriately utilize pathways to permanent housing and prioritize individuals or family needs in order to limit emergency housing stays to no longer than necessary. So the point here, all of the discussion about, is 12% of the general fund enough? No, it's definitely not. But do all those resources have to come from the general fund? No, they don't. There are other sources at the state level, the federal level, that we should tap, and hopefully, there will be a braiding together intentionally to have maximum effect. But there also has to be a plan to make this work that centers on pathways to permanent housing, and prioritizing. One of the reasons for my appreciation for this initiative is that it continuously centers on the situation of chronically homeless people and people with highest barriers. These are the people who have been at the bottom of the ladder for access to permanent housing, and I believe this would change that in order to break open this impasse.
Okay, thanks for that. Since you brought up the 12%, Mr. Sidran, go ahead.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't see you.
That's all right. So I think we can look at the city of Los Angeles as an indicator of what may happen here. In 2016, Los Angeles passed a $1.2 billion tax levy to produce 6,000 units of homeless housing by 2022, along with supportive services. It's very similar in design to the basic elements of 29 with respect to housing and services. They also, like Seattle, went down the Martin versus Boise rabbit hole starting in 2019 and pulled back from dealing with their encampment issue. While there's some debate in Los Angeles about whether they'll hit their 6,000 units in 2022, they're making good progress. There's no debate in Los Angeles that they have more homeless now than when they started, and that their encampment problem is worse now than when they started. So as Lisa and John and Tiffani have mentioned, one of the issues that we need to address is to what extent is there a migration factor in terms of the homeless population? I don't really know. Danny, you recently wrote a column on that touched on this migration question. Mayor Durkin just, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, mentioned that she believes that approximately 60% of the people who are in the encampments in Seattle are not from Seattle. But whatever the dimensions are, we should ask ourselves, if you expand housing of various kinds, and if, as I believe will happen, you create a context in which encampments are allowed for a period of time or tolerated in more places than other cities, then I think it'll be very hard to get ahead of the curve, because other jurisdictions, even within our region, are, despite all the language in the Charter Amendment about engaging and promoting the Regional Housing Authority, Seattle's going off in this direction by itself. To create 2,000 units in a year, to in effect make it more difficult, while Auburn, Mercer Island, other cities are making it less difficult to clear encampments, may well produce a migratory effect. And if it does, I don't see how you get ahead of the curve.
Okay, so 2/3 of Seattle is also not from Seattle, including me. So the whole issue of where people are from seems, I agree that certain public policies can draw people to different places sometimes, but I've never bought that people end up living under the I-5 bridge because they love the soggy Wonder Bread sandwiches that they get from the mission truck when it comes around. But anyway, that's an editorial comment by me. John, you raised your hand first.
Yeah, just real briefly, the model that we're following here in Seattle is not one of going alone. It's following what 80 cities around the country are doing and having a successful impact on their chronic homeless population. They're following Community Solutions, an organization out of Washington, D.C., a nonprofit that's working in 80 cities, small cities, large cities, and having a dramatic effect on their homeless population when ours is going in the other direction. So we're taking a model that we know works. And Mark mentioned the city of Los Angeles, and in some respects, he's right. They haven't made progress. And now they have a federal court order and a federal judge lording over them and issued a 110-page ruling that essentially tells them, their city government and county government, to do exactly what this charter amendment would require, to move with a greater sense of urgency, to provide services and emergency housing to people on the streets. So we can wait for a federal judge to come tell the city of Seattle to do that, or voters can tell the city this November.
I see you, Tiffany. Go ahead.
Thank you. And yeah, Danny, thank you for those comments to Mark's. Yeah, I just like, it's just incredibly dehumanizing to even give a notion that people are moving here and choosing to be homeless, and that we're creating an incentive to stay outside. Like it's incredibly dehumanizing. It's also very territorial. And even though we might fall on the same side of this as saying no, as you said earlier, like I would say that our values are like very starkly opposed. And for John, you're talking about LA and the court order. That court order also comes with a hell of a lot of money behind it. And it puts forward a lot more than you're proposing in your charter amendment. And there's just no way that if you were truly wanting to be compassionate and truly wanting to solve the crisis and get rid of visible poverty, as you've said over and over again, you would not keep recycling the same narrative that we have enough money and that we just need to spend it better. You wouldn't point to the federal government and saying that there's 800 million coming our way. That's a county number, that's not a city number. The City of Seattle Council just spent the first influx of money from the federal government, and all of it, the vast majority of it, went to housing and homelessness issues. And you talked about at the 43rd LD DEMS that the first dollar needs to come towards those who are unhoused, not the last. And I mean, are you making a case that the police budget, which it takes an enormous chunk of our city resources, that needs to be on the table to pay for everything that you enumerate in the charter amendment? There's just, the public just needs to know that there's absolutely no way that 18 million extra dollars is going to pay for everything they say that they're going to do. And finally, because I know John will also point to the fact that we have record income and our budget is just proliferating with all of this money, I want the audience to know that some of those projections are due to the Jumpstart tax, which is a progressive revenue tax that is going to be used explicitly for housing and homelessness. And John and the Chamber of Commerce opposed that progressive revenue source to bring our neighbors inside.
Well, they did pass the progressive revenue source, and it's currently on the books. So who opposed it and who was for it at this point seems like water under the bridge. I want to point out that
unless
money,
there's an appeal of the judge's decision.
That's true. It's not over yet. You're quite right. I do want to point out though that the Jumpstart tax, the vast majority of it, they sort of tentatively earmarked for permanent supportive housing. So the permanent housing that you were talking about earlier, there's already, it may not be big enough, but there's already a plan and a funding source for that. So I want to drill down on this funding formula thing, because this is the part of your chart, the charter amendment, that kind of bugs me the most. Anytime there's a cap, when you try to tie the hands of a democratically elected government, it's kind of like a Tim Eyman maneuver, right? So what the charter amendment says is the city has to spend a minimum of 12% of the city general fund on the subjects of this, on homelessness. And that this year was about 185 million. Next year will probably be around 200 million. And I don't understand how you get to what we already use some of that money for, all the way up to 2,000 new units of shelter. So the cost breakdown on shelter, if you did 2,000 tiny houses, which is by far the cheapest, and in my opinion, the best, it would cost about $40 million a year just to support those tiny house villages. And if you did all of them as kind of the most expensive Just Care hotel program, their costs have fluctuated anywhere between, I don't know, 35,000 per unit per year up to 70,000. And if it's 70,000, that means it's going to cost you $140 million, which you've almost used up the entire fund already. So I don't get that part, how this is enough money.
So Danny, there's not a cap on city spending to implement this charter. There's a floor that is set of at least 12% of the current general fund budget must be spent on human services and the investments called for in this charter to help bring people inside. I think where the debate lies here is whether you need a new tax to implement this or not. No one is arguing that we're going to need to spend more to provide drug and alcohol treatment that we're not providing today, or mental health treatment that we're not providing today, or case management and counseling, or the investments in the emergency and temporary and permanent housing that we're not providing at the levels today to bring people inside. There's no debate there. We're going to have to spend more as a city. I think there's plenty of debate, and that will continue, of whether we need to raise a new tax. And we've heard that debate for the last 10 years. During the greatest economic expansion of our city's history, so-called progressives in the city of Seattle have always put poor people suffering in our parks at the end of the line, that we can't help you until we raise the next tax. That when our general fund was $1.2 billion, we can't help you until we raise the next tax. Now that it's $1.6 billion, and we're getting $250 million from the Biden administration, and when there's $5 billion available from the federal government to municipalities across the city, we're still hearing the same old refrain: we can't help the people suffering the most until we have another tax. And if the city of Seattle thinks they need another tax once this is adopted by voters, they are free to present that plan to voters or adopt it themselves, and we can have that debate. But we believe that we should have a plan in place first that sets clear objectives and metrics and an approach for how we're going to bring people inside. That's where we should focus this debate. And if the city thinks they need a new tax to implement it, they can make that case to voters.
I think Mark, had his hand up first, and then Tiffany after him.
So we really need to talk about using the charter in this way, because it's unprecedented. In the 152 years since Seattle's first charter, there's never been anything like this. And there are a number of reasons why we should not use the charter to accomplish the objectives of this program. Just focusing for a moment on the budget issues, we are taking 12% of the general fund and putting it in a human services lockbox, regardless of any other funding that's coming in, where that that exact percentage may or may not be needed. But when you do that, you're taking money away from other city services, because the 12% is in a lockbox means it's not available for libraries, it's not available for the parks or for police and fire or infrastructure or anything else the city does. So there's a reason why we do annual budgeting. And it's in order to take account of changing circumstances. When the proponents drafted this, they had no way of knowing there was going to be a fire hose of federal money that would be available for these purposes coming. But nonetheless, they're locked into 12%, not just this year or next year, but for 6 years. And this is one of the fundamental issues about using the charter this way. It is
like he, sorry to interrupt, but like he said, because I incorrectly called it a cap, it's really a floor. They're only locked into spending. You have to spend at least that amount.
That's right. It takes 12%, right?
So if they get a fire hose of money, they can spend 20% if they want.
No, my point, Danny, is they can't set aside less than 12% of the general fund. True. If you had hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money, you might want to say, well, we only want to spend 5% of the city's general fund on human services because we take the other money and supplant it over here and use it for these other public services. It is the folly of inflexibility. Remember, the charter, every word of this amendment is locked in stone, cannot be changed for 6 years. Now, if there's one thing that we have learned over the last 25 or 30 years, at least, that I've been involved with these issues, from the 10-year plan to end homelessness, to the street sync effort, to the Seattle King County plan to end youth homelessness, and all of the other efforts, all very well intentioned, all very well funded to one degree or another, lots of money being spent by smart people who are trying to do the right thing. But it turns out that this problem is complicated. It's difficult. It's hard to figure out just how to do it, both in terms of policy and in terms of politics. So the likelihood that the proponents of this charter amendment have nailed it, they got it exactly right, even though they drafted this behind closed doors for months, didn't have a public process, and then in just a few days before they filed it, rewrote key sections like the encampment and added a sunset clause. The fact that, do they have it exactly right now? They better, because it's locked in for 6 years. And courts, I am confident, are going to have a lot to say about what it means. And there's no way to respond to that because it's locked in.
All right, Tiffany, you were next.
Thanks. I just like for John and for the public, this is just really, really important. It's like the onus is truly on the big business community. The onus is on Compassion Seattle to prove that we have enough money and that we just need to spend it better. We've been hearing this for years. That has been a hallmark of their fight against progressive taxation. So I really challenge you all to prove that we have the money and that we just need to spend it better. I just think that otherwise you're just able to kind of hide behind this rhetoric.
Okay, Lisa.
So I think there's no question, that the floor that's established in this initiative is not enough. And it is also not too much. What we have the opportunity to do here is to agree as a community on a policy framework. And you really don't hear all that much debate about the policy framework. Do that and then see, sort of move into the next conversation about and how much will this cost? And then you move into the next conversation about how best to secure the funds that a consensus or a majority agrees that it should cost. Those are three separate decision points, and different coalitions can come together at each stage. This is the policy moment where we move decisively away from an era of moving people around the city, recognize what it takes for people to not have to live. The second sentence of this initiative says that it's the policy of the city that people should not have to live in public places. I'm paraphrasing, but not that people should not live in public places, that people should not have to live in public places, recognizing that this is a question of need and alternatives. So this is the policy step. If it is adopted, then we do have to have the conversation about what it costs. And at that moment, I fully expect that the coalitions will shift, and that's okay. And honestly, business is taking a chance here by understanding that there could be a majority to accomplish this through a new tax. It's also not the only strategy that could be used. So I just think this is not, when you look at the other comparable, and to Mark's point about don't use the charter this way, good government, the King County charter is used this way all the time. There's even a charter amendment about the Department of Public Defense being independent. I was involved in that. The city does not have that same tradition, but right across James Street, this happens all the time. It's a way of marking that something is quite serious and shouldn't be subjected to sort of yearly shifts. It's a very important public policy. But in places like New York City, has a state, or New York State has a state constitutional right to shelter. The Washington Constitution has, establishes public education as a paramount duty. Neither of those sort of paramount duty concepts have a fixed amount of money attached to them. And to do so, I mean, that truly doesn't belong in a constitution, because that requirement is going to change based on circumstances. You wouldn't want to be locked into that. And it has to float based on, working backwards from what it takes. So this is just like those other efforts to place some very important public obligation above the sort of, the sea of everyday struggle, and say, we are just going to accomplish this, and we're going to do what it takes. And it is.
Right. Can I interrupt you? Because you said that this is about the policy moment, and I've talked to you before, and this is why you're supporting this, my understanding. And what, just to drill down in your mind, that policy moment, what's different here is non-congregate shelter, that there's going to be a presumption that was sort of created by the pandemic, that when you are asked to leave the park, that the shelter you will be offered is a room of your own, right? Is that
No, that's not at all how I would frame the policy that the initiative.
Okay, what are you talking about?
The initiative puts forward, number one, that this is one of the paramount obligations of city government, to make sure that people do not have to live in public places. Number two, it establishes a methodology through which that will be accomplished. And it isn't A, telling people to leave a park, and B, offering them something, and not really setting that up so that it's going to be effective because it matches the need of the person and they will feel like they can say yes to that offer. So it mobilizes, it requires that the resources to make those offers be mobilized. It requires that the way in which they are offered is trust-based, take seriously the behavioral health challenges and barriers that people face, offers culturally distinct and relevant services, is person-centered, is based on an assessment of individual needs, and succeeds in people willingly accepting what is offered. That's a completely different paradigm than what we've had so far. And that's, I think, that is the only approach that will work.
Okay, thank you for that. Mark wants to argue about charters.
Well, I do, because I think it's really an important principle. Okay. This is nothing like the King County Charter process. For example, normally you have an open public process when you're amending a foundational document. Traditionally, you'd have the League of Women Voters, the Municipal League, and various stakeholders. You'd have public hearings. That's the county process. That's not what was done here. And secondly, it is absolutely not the case that either the Seattle Charter or the King County Charter have highly detailed programs defined in their charter. What Lisa mentioned about the Public Defender Agency, that's a provision that simply describes a function of government, bringing a function into the government, public defense, but it doesn't get into the minutia of the structure of the public defender program. This is a very detailed piece of legislation, 1,500 words, a lot of which are vague and ambiguous, and it gets into a lot of different areas. It defines labor standards for the people who are delivering the services. It waives the land use code for the siting of projects, which means a lot, which we probably should talk about because people will be interested to know that. It mandates diversion programs for people based on whether their crimes are, quote, connected to behavioral health issues or, quote, income instability or homelessness. These are separate pieces. So in other words, it's touching on a broad array of public policies in great detail, and at the same time in ways that are vague and ambiguous. And there's no precedent for this in either the city or the King County Charter. And there are very good reasons. Again, I keep coming back to the fundamental point of the folly of inflexibility to define in great detail programs for 6 years where, it's interesting. This provision calls for quarterly reports of how things are going, but what are people supposed to do with the information? Theoretically, you would want to be able to respond based on experience and make changes if changes are needed. you won't be able to make any changes that contravene the precise language of the charter.
So we have a question that I thought was quite insightful from the member of the public about that very issue about whether this thing is really inflexible or not. And this person wrote, one of the critiques of the charter amendment is that how it is interpreted and implemented will depend upon who is elected mayor this fall. If the new mayor wants to use the amendment for sweeps with little else, that will happen. If the mayor wants to expand the Just Care program and even commit the city to 2,000 permanent housing units, that can happen. How can we have any certainty about what will be the effect of passing this charter amendment? Anyone?
Yeah, when I said that no, statement like this is idiot proof, this is exactly what I meant. But it is therefore significant that there is a shifting of the window of debate, and key constituencies that have previously supported sweeps, the NAV team, and what are essentially displacement strategies have thought better of that approach because, for a variety of reasons, but I think including new leadership in some of those organizations, but also just because having watched it played out, it's become evident that people who were, told to leave Denny Park, and the park was posted and offers of shelter were made and a few were accepted, but most people just sort of, left. And those people ended up in front of other businesses, and the businesses understood that they came from Denny Park, and that approach just doesn't actually serve anyone's interest. So I think there's been some learning. And if we in civil society sort of form a picket fence and insist that our elected leaders take a certain approach, the odds that it will be taken are much greater. To me, the coalition here is important for that reason.
I think if you read the language of the charter, it's very clear that this is a different approach than what is currently being implemented today by the city of Seattle, and far different from sweeps and the navigation team that were city policy for a number of years. The provision of treatment, both for mental health, substance use, alcohol, the types of housing that are required to be provided, the language is very specific. And everybody that's watching today, listen to this debate, listen to what other people are saying, but read the amendment for yourself. It's very clear around the policy prescription that is required here should this be adopted by voters.
Tiffany, I saw you raising your hand.
I wish, Lisa, that in reality, that many businesses have just rode this wave over to knowing that sweeps do not work. That's not the case. That's not the case on the ground. Keep changing these words, that this is not a displacement measure, that this is not a sweeps measure, that this isn't a forced removal. There's no way to get around the end of, I think it's the section 3, the last sentence that talks about, even if an encampment is enclosed, the residents may still be asked to shift their belongings and their structures to make space in public areas. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. The word shift is a euphemism. That is a sweep. Asking someone to move from point A to point B and to move all of their belongings without shelter, without resources, without outreach, that is a sweep. That is a displacement. That is a forced removal. So that is actually what our city policy is now. So when I talked about at the beginning that this is actually cementing the status quo of sweeps into the city charter, this is what I mean for the audience. This is what I mean. Right now, we used to have most of our sweeps used to be a 72-hour notice. So it would give people time to have outreach, to have services, to be connected to people, to find a new place to go and to move their belongings, at their pace. But under Mayor Durkin, we have shifted wholly away from 72-hour sweeps and the MDARS. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to remember the acronym now, but those MDARS was a whole community panel of people who came together to try to humanize the forced movement of people. Those MDARS now do not get triggered on when we do anything besides a 72-hour sweep. So we have now immediate sweeps, 5, 10, 15, 20-minute sweeps. The MDARS aren't necessary to be watched. The Office of Civil Rights has been removed from sweeps a few years back. This mayor has created a terrible scenario of forced removal and displacement. And this charter amendment is like Jenny Durkin's dream baked into the city constitution. So we can say these things, but they're just not real.
Mark?
Well, I have to disagree with John. I think the only thing that's really clear about the amendment is that it's unclear. That's why Tiffani and I can have exactly opposite readings of the same language. And I do hope that people will read it, because I defy anybody to actually even casually read through this and come to the conclusion that it's clear about what it says, what it means, and how it's going to work. I think it is, the only thing that's clear about it is that it's going to result in a lot of litigation if it passes, and the courts will clarify what it means. And again, the important point is, once those court decisions come down and they say whatever they say about all of the various issues that are raised in this charter amendment, that's it. It cannot be changed. The city council can't fix it. Nobody can fix it. You can only change a charter provision by going back to the voters. Why we would want to do that for 6 years really mystifies me. The other thing that I'll add is this notion behind doing the charter amendment somehow is going to make City Hall do something is totally baffling and mystifying to me. First of all, when you read the language, you will find that it involves all kinds of judgment and discretion to implement this. Words like appropriate and shall try to do this and try to do that. So the implementation depends on City Hall exercising its discretion and judgment to implement it. So
isn't that the opposite of what you just said, which is that the thing is too strict and can't ever be changed? I mean,
the words can't be changed. I'm saying
I know, but if the words allow discretion on the part of City Hall, then why is that a problem?
Well, let's suppose that the court interprets the words in a way that is contrary to what the majority of the people of Seattle thought they were doing when they enacted it.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But if nothing else is accomplished other than it being a message at the City Hall that they have to stand up 2,000 units of non-congregate emergency shelter, I mean, that part seems pretty clear to me.
Yes,
now,
it is.
I've criticized the two backers here because there isn't a concrete way to pay for it. It seems like an unfunded mandate. And so maybe Uncle Joe will send the money and everything will be fine. But I feel like when you spell out the city shall provide 1,000 units in the first 6 months and then another 1,000 units, and then it pretty specifically dictates that those are not going to be mats on the floor in a church basement. They're going to be non-congregate shelter. That part anyway seems pretty clear to me.
Well, but Danny,
let's be clear. President Biden has already sent the money. $125 million has already been received by City Hall. They chose to spend it in ways not consistent with this charter. They didn't spend a majority to address homelessness. They're going to get another $120 million in another couple of months to appropriate. And it's exactly the reason their decisions and their inability to appropriate dollars to get people inside are exactly the reasons we need this charter amendment. So they're going to have another opportunity in 6 months with $125 million that are coming.
Like Just Care got money from this money that Jon Scholes is talking about. RV Safe Lots got money from the ARPA. There's a bunch of others. I encourage people to actually go look at what the city council just voted on. All of that money is going towards housing and homelessness. It's not enough to solve the problem, but just go do your own research. Like Just Care got a lot of money from there. And there's going to be another round of money, as John is rightly saying. And that is where that money will go, is to housing and homelessness.
Well, Danny, let me just
hold on. Setting aside the issue of sweeps or not sweeps or removal of encampments, which I think is super important to Seattle residents, that we resolve that, and we have failed to do that this evening. But it sounds like, Tiffani, you're saying that the city on the shelter side is already doing what this initiative asks for. They just can't do it as fast or as much because they don't have enough money. Is that right?
Yeah, because John keeps pointing to these pools of money and saying that the city council is not spending them towards housing and homelessness. And that's just a blatant lie. And people need to do their own research on it. We at Real Change, we fought for our RV Safe Lot spaces for the 2,000 people living in their RVs and won some of those. It's absolutely not enough. We will be continuing to fight for more. I hope that John and the business community supports that intervention as a temporary solution on our way to permanent housing. But just this, it's just a blatant lie. That's what I'm pointing out.
Both things can't be true here, Tiffani. Either the current city approach is insufficient and inappropriate, or it's going to solve the problem. I mean, you've argued both points here. Both can't be true. So you're criticizing the Dirk administration and characterizing the charter amendment as enshrining her sweeps proposal on one hand, and on the other, you're saying we're on the current course and speed is great. We've got enough money and we're investing it in the right ways. So both of these things can't be true. And I think people can see for themselves when you walk around any park or any public space in our city, more people suffering today than ever before, and we're spending more money and not having the result we want.
So that's just a very wildly gross mischaracterization of my position, because I called you out on lying about the money that the city council just spent from the federal government. So folks can just go back to what I've said at the beginning and know that that's not the case.
I think it's really important to look at how they spent it though, because the 50 million out of the 120 million that they appropriated for homelessness won't help a single person on the street anytime soon. It's not to treatment. It's not to mental health services. It's to permanent supportive housing, which we need to do. But again, we're not acting in recognition of the emergency we have today and the thousands of people that are out there suffering. And we shouldn't tell them it's going to be 4 years before we can help you and bring you inside.
Well, I'm glad you are admitting now that the city council did spend ARPA money on housing and homelessness, because you just said that they didn't. And Lisa, I would like
not
to
enough
ask
and not in the right ways.
Your expert opinion on if shelter or if on treatment works if you don't have housing to go to after.
No, and the initiative, you know, in my view, is constructed to foster a shelter or housing first approach. No, it's completely critical to pair low barrier field-based behavioral health services, which are the words in the initiative, with shelter and housing. And that, I mean, the approach that's in the initiative is what many people in the city have been fighting for a long time. And it is something that many city leaders have, you know, made statements of support for. I think we have not seen, despite the leadership of some individuals in city government and in county government, we have not seen a unified regional commitment to this approach. And trying to get there has been hard, right? We have been stuck in this place for a very long time, and trying to, you know, break out of that impasse and bring new allies to a housing first approach with appropriate resources and urgency, and through the lens of, you know, person-centered, individually designed, voluntary acceptance of resources. That's a step forward. So concur, but I think that that's what the initiative reflects.
Thanks. Mark, you got to be brief though, because I'm about to have to wrap up here.
Okay, well, 2 quick points. One is, and you know, it's a challenge because this is very complicated piece of legislation. Number one, there's a provision here that supersedes all existing laws that are in conflict with it. I would challenge John or Lisa to tell us which laws are being superseded if it passes. I assume that the law that prohibits camping in parks and obstructing sidewalks, these laws are going to be superseded to the extent that they simply say you can't do this here. Whereas the amendment says, well, you may or may not be able to do this here. We'll have to evaluate the process as called for in the amendment. The second point is, and this would be a question that Lisa might be able to answer, why incorporate into an initiative about homelessness and services a provision that mandates the creation of diversion programs rather than prosecution for people who have committed offenses that are, quote, connected to income instability, behavioral health issues, or a lack of housing? Why is that in here?
I'm happy to say that that was already in the initiative when I first saw it. And I think that that's because of the learning that particularly led by King County over the last several years through the Familiar Faces Initiative and others that, remember One Table? Anybody remember that conversation a couple of years ago? One of the leading finding, Tiffani and I were excluded from that because we were working on some other table. But anyway, I heard that one of the findings of that process was that the criminal legal system involvement is one of the, if not the preeminent driver of continued homelessness. So this is recognition of the data and evidence that our region and the leaders in our region have accumulated over the last several years about how to stop making things worse. It doesn't require diversion in any particular case. It requires a bias toward diversion when not to divert would actually worsen the situation and make the person more likely to remain homeless.
And that was something we advocated be included, Mark. That was something we wanted because the current approach is failing and everybody knows it. And because the chronically homeless population is represented at a rate 45 times the general public in our jail system. So if you like the status quo, vote against the charter amendment. If you think we need to do something different in how we're dealing with folks who are chronically homeless, who are also committing the laws, then you'll appreciate the diversion investments in this charter amendment.
Well, let me just be clear. We already have diversion programs, number one. Number two, this is not
and not scaled up.
Not limited to homeless people. And number three, if people think we're doing a good job with shoplifting and the criminal prosecution of property crimes, then they would support it.
I got to stop you because we're running up against the time. And I'm sure we could go all night, but people probably don't really want us to. I got a number of questions from the public that said, essentially, for the panelists who are, because it's really easy, and this is what we've done tonight, when anyone proposes anything, to poke holes in it. It's what I do for a living. So a bunch of people wrote in and said, for the panelists who are against Measure 2029, what would you do instead? Like, please suggest a concrete and realistic alternative. So Tiffany, you can start with you. What would you do in lieu of this?
Yeah, I knew this question was going to come up, and I love it. We hear it a lot when we're out tabling with folks and talking about why they should vote no. And the reality is, I wish that I was focusing on a wide variety of things. I wish that I was focusing on building 2,000 RV safe lots with wraparound services, on scaling up our hygiene stations, on opening up more areas for folks to go inside during like this heat wave, making sure that permanent supportive housing is coming online. I would like to be working on all those things. My entire campaign plan for the fall is now scrapped because instead I have to spend my time fighting a bunch of large businesses and rich folks who want to dominate city policy through a charter amendment. So after that, stay tuned.
I didn't hear a plan, Danny.
All right. And then Mark, you've ably critiqued the some of the legal holes in this, as you see, but I know you're the volunteer side of your nature. You've done a lot to work at the DESC and so forth, which, by the way, was involved in the crafting of this. So what would you do instead? Like, why?
Well,
if we really waste a year, like Tiffany just suggested, arguing about this and then defeating it, we will have done nothing, right? So what would be better?
Well, first, we would have at least done no harm. And I think amending the charter this way does harm. So number one, I wouldn't do a charter amendment. This would be a completely acceptable vehicle done by initiative, doing just a standard initiative, which after 2 years can be changed. So number one, I wouldn't amend the charter. Number two, I'm all for the housing and services, 2,000 units, supportive services, the wraparound, everything that's described in this charter amendment as the housing and services element. That's fine. That's a good plan. It shouldn't be in the charter, but the fundamentals, I have no problem with that at all. I would not create legal barriers to the removal of encampments that exist now. As to where people go, you know, I'm fully supportive of something that you wrote about, Danny, in your last column, and that the city of Boston has done and other cities have done. You know, the worst thing in the world are these unauthorized encampments, wherever they are, including in green belts or the jungle. Create a place where you can have an authorized encampment, where you have sanitation services, where you have public health facilities, where you have treatment resources. It is extremely unlikely, based on experience, that we are going to house our way out of this problem because we have open borders and because other jurisdictions are not as generous as we are or taking the same approach we are. So my plan would be You're not allowed to camp in parks or on the sidewalk. We have a designated camp area over here, whether it's tiny houses or tents or whatever it is. And that's how we manage the problem. That is a plan. I would get rid of mandating diversion programs for people who have addiction and mental health issues connected to their crimes and who are not, by the way, homeless. I would not invalidate the land use code, which means citing projects without regard to single family residence zoning, without regard to height or density or lot coverage issues. There's a lot here that I wouldn't do because I think they're bad ideas, but the fundamentals of the housing and services, I fully support. But I also believe you have got to have a plan that meaningfully deters encampments in places where you don't want them. And what this will do is establish a burdensome process that will make for, just a longer process to clear an encampment.
All right, so real quick, Lisa and John, this is your charter amendment, so you guys get the last word.
It's not my charter amendment, but I appreciate that those who initiated it did so. I think it's a significant shift toward what we absolutely must do if we want to see an end to people living unsheltered in our public spaces. It will not end the debate. It will not be the last tough question that we have to answer, but at least it frames up the correct questions and eliminates some really bad solutions that have been captivating to many over the last several years, and it puts us in the right conversation. Thanks for having us.
So I would just urge people to assess the status quo in the city of Seattle today. What you see in your parks and sidewalks, people suffering, the number of people unsheltered, and what we're spending. And read the headlines over the last year, 2, 3, 4 of political leaders arguing, debating, and the continued dysfunction that's emanated out of City Hall. That's the status quo. And there's been lots of critics of this proposal. Very few of them have offered an alternative plan. So that's the status quo and the reality that we face in this city. And I think the sooner we can recognize that and recognize that this is truly a public health crisis. This is a crisis of people suffering from substance use disorder and mental illness, particularly within our chronic homeless population on our streets. And if we think we can chase them to another park and make things better for them or our city, or chase them to another city successfully and declare this problem solved, we're fooling ourselves. That's been an element of the strategy over the last 6 years. So the sooner we recognize that this is a public health crisis, the only way we're going to solve it is by investing in the set of treatments and interventions that are necessary to bring people inside and meet the underlying conditions that led them out to the streets in the first place. The sooner that we'll open our parks and public spaces and help those in need. So I encourage everybody to read the charter amendment, and you can read on compassionseattle.org what other people are saying about it, including many of the service providers, along with Lisa, that had a hand in writing the amendment itself.
All right, well, thanks for all you panelists. You're able debaters, so able that I'm not sure I was even needed here. You took control of my forum. No, I'm kidding. I learned a lot. That was good. And if there's any common ground to grab onto, it seems to me like something Mark Sidran said, that he's all for the new shelter and the 2,000 units and so forth. And I feel like Tiffani would probably echo that. I think she wants more than that. So I don't know if people can somehow grab onto that and go down to City Hall and get them to build it before November, right? So Steve, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. And let the debate continue.
Thank you. Thanks, Danny, for moderating. Thank you to all the panelists for volunteering your time to be here tonight. And thank you to all of the hundreds of people who attended and will watch this recording afterward. And you can head to the same site. We have lots of information about all of the information that was presented tonight on a variety of different topics. We tried to keep this fair and balanced. So we hope you appreciated it. And thanks again. Have a good night.